What's up, guys? Welcome back to another Rogue Macro video. Going to go over the post that I put out yesterday on roguemacro.substack.com. It's about the new national security strategy and why it's so revolutionary. It really talks to a lot of what I have been talking about over the last several years, specifically deglobalization in this new strategy, but it does touch on fertility rates and monetary matters with the global reserve currency being the US dollar. I expand on those at the end here. So let's just go through what's in this post. So I talk about what the strategy doc actually says. It clearly defines ends and means for US foreign policy strategy, and it explicitly rejects vague universalism. So for a long time, the U.S. has had to shoulder a lot of global burdens for some vaguely defined global good, right? And that we can see that in the outsourcing of U.S. manufacturing and the cultural and mental health decline in the United States as well. The U.S. is no longer willing to shoulder the burden and no longer willing to tolerate structural trade imbalances. And it will no longer subordinate its sovereignty to international institutions that are at best indifferent to American interests and at worst openly hostile to them. One of the good examples of this is recently when Trump went to the UN, they cut the escalator, they cut the teleprompter, they even cut the speakers in the venue itself. Volume was on the video, but not in the venue itself. They couldn't hear him. So these are openly hostile acts, as well as pushing for keeping the U.S. involved with Ukraine, not letting Ukraine accept peace deals early on, like the Istanbul Agreement and other things, keeping this war going against U.S. national interest. And then when the U.S. does try to stand up for itself against these drug cartels, then the Europeans come out and say, and these international institutions, Brussels and Davos, they come out and say, oh, that's against international law, which none of that is against international law. And if it was, international law does not trump U.S. sovereignty. Okay, U.S. is a sovereign state. They are not subordinate to international institutions, which is the globalist objective. Okay. From that foundation, it outlines what the U.S. wants. The U.S. wants survival, of course, continued its exceptionalism, and its sovereignty. It reaffirms that every country has a right to its own sovereignty and unique culture. It's not these emerging markets. It's not the worst places in the world that have a right to their own culture. It's also the most developed places in the world. They have a right to exist. The culture of Italy, the culture of France, the culture of the United States, they have rights to exist as well. And of course, to their own sovereignty. Threats to the U.S. are defined in military terms, but also in foreign influence operations. And I think that's very important in the modern context, because with nuclear weapons, there's no longer going to be total global war. There's going to be a lot of these foreign influence operations trying to undermine administrations, undermine governments, cause civil wars, those types of things. And then eventually to put the rubble of those foreign influence operations and put that rubble under the control of a foreign power. So that's more of a modern concept, and so very important that it is put in here. Border control and immigration are explicitly removed from the realm of abstract humanitarianism. This goes to that level of the top political unit is not the international institution. If you make the international institution sovereign over the countries, then what are the use of borders? What's the use of being a citizen of your country? You're a global citizen now, and there's no borders, and you should want to help these other citizens of the world that are just like you, because you're a citizen of the world, and they should be able to come into your country, and you should be able to take care of them. But no, this whole basic framing is rejected, and border control and immigration are strengthened. Economic strength is treated as inseparable from security. with particular emphasis on resilient infrastructure, robust manufacturing base, and strong military, and a dynamic domestic economy. Technological leadership is explicitly prioritized for the United States, and the restoration of American cultural and spiritual health. The latter is an extraordinary admission. It's a recognition of the mental and cultural stress that the U.S. is no longer willing to bear for globalism. So it's the U.S. being the world policeman, the U.S. putting out fires, the U.S. being even as much as the Federal Reserve having swap lines to the rest of the world and taking care of the rest of the world and being this global benevolent hegemon has really hollowed out U.S. manufacturing, the U.S. economy, and our um, cultural and spiritual health, and that we're no longer willing to bear that. The document is explicitly focused on foreign policy, and this is what the core vital national interests are of the new America First strategy. Monroe Doctrine. Bring back the Monroe Doctrine. The U.S. is the big dominant player in the Western Hemisphere. No other major players are allowed to have militaries here. And even to go as far as things like the Panama Canal, they had handed it over to Chinese control. And the U.S. said, no, it's not going to be under Chinese control. We have the Monroe Doctrine here. This is we're dominant here. Get out, China. So that's kind of what they're talking about in this one. Reversing ongoing damage to the United States of unfair trade and things like drug trafficking and stuff like that. But at the same time, they explicitly talk about maintaining the freedom of navigation and open sea lanes. So that was probably a breath of fresh air or a sigh of relief from the rest of the world. What are we going to do about freedom of navigation and sea lanes if the U.S. isn't there to maintain those? And they're saying they want to maintain them, but only under these certain circumstances, okay? Only if we are sovereign over our own country, supporting our allies, especially preserving the freedom, security, and Western identity of Europe. We're going to talk more about Europe here in a second. Preventing foreign rivals from dominating the Middle East and its vital choke points. So they'll go into it here a little bit more, but the idea is that nobody gets to dominate. The U.S. is saying we don't want to dominate. We don't want anyone else to dominate. We want everyone to be sovereign over their own countries and get about making their own countries better, ensuring the preeminence of U.S. technology and U.S. standards in AI, biotech, and quantum computing. Okay, what's the exact strategy here? This was an unmistakable shift in geopolitics. The document insists on a focused definition of national interest, rejecting the idea that everything everywhere is America's responsibility. That's what it felt like for my entire life. And so they're explicitly rejecting that, and they want to define what is the national interest. Peace through strength is reaffirmed, but paired with explicit predisposition toward non-interventionism. This is notable given that non-interventionism defined American statecraft for most of its history through roughly 75 years. It took a lot to get us into World War I, took a lot to get us into World War II. And after World War II is when everything kind of shifted and the United States became this benevolent hegemon, at least of the free world at that time, and then later after the Cold War, over the whole world. But that is what they're talking about here. The document embraces what it calls flexible realism, an acceptance that different nations will organize themselves differently and that the United States need not impose its social or political model on others to maintain stability. Striking shift right there. Of course, we wanted to spread Western values. That included some cultural values, but it also included economic values and political values. And that's no longer going to happen from the United States, is what they're saying. Most striking is the primacy of nations as the organizing principle of world order. Like I said, the international institutions wanted to be sovereign, and everybody needed to fall in line with these international treaties, international agreements. Most recently, we have things like the climate treaties, as well as the WHO, World Health Organization, and their pandemic treaties, signing away the sovereignty of the nation state to these international organizations. And we also have things like Basel III. I mean, these are international banking regulations that are voluntarily gone into, but they have some international enforcement. And so That's not putting the country sovereign. That's making something above the nation state as the sovereign entity, which that is being completely rejected here. Um, Attempts by foreign actors of international bodies to censor Americans and influence domestic discourse are treated as violations of sovereignty. That's pretty important. We see that case going on right now with X and Musk in Europe. That is directly, directly speaks to that. That it's an American company. I think Musk is an American citizen, and so this is they're trying to censor Americans. All right. The balance of power, blah, blah, blah. United States explicitly rejects global domination for itself while simultaneously committing to prevent any other power from achieving global or even regional dominance. The U.S. welcomes multipolarity and treats it as natural and stabilizing. Finally, the document elevates competence and merit as strategic assets, rejecting DEI frameworks, cultural Marxism, identity politics, and the notion that global talent is required. The era of mass migration is declared over, framed as a return to historically normal and stabilizing condition of sovereign states. The primary purpose of the U.S. government is reaffirmed as the protection of rights of American citizens, not global citizens, not protecting the rights of all these people trying to flee their war-torn, backwards countries. American citizens the are the primary purpose of U.S. government, and the abuse of state power in the name of ideology is explicitly rejected. Burden sharing replaces burden absorption by the United States, with allies expected to take primary responsibility for their own security rather than relying on indefinitely on American largesse. They also have a long section here on Western Hemisphere, how we're going to address that, the Asia, Indo-Pacific, Middle East, Europe, and Africa. I really just want to concentrate on Europe here. So the national security strategy describes Europe not merely as economically stagnant, but facing the prospect of civilizational erasure, citing censorship of free speech, suppression of political opposition, collapsing birth rates, mass migration, and the loss of national identity. This section alone is worth the read because it just blasts on Europe. The document openly questions whether some NATO members will remain culturally European within a few decades, and whether they will therefore continue to share the assumptions that underpin the alliance itself. You know, are the treaties like NATO? Um, we made them with a country, with European countries, and now if these countries become minority European, maybe even going towards Sharia law or something like that, are those treaties still with that same country? No, they're not. So, therefore, this undermines the whole idea of this treaty in the first place, that these countries are not the same countries anymore. Most strikingly, the national security strategy calls for cultivating resistance within European nations to their current trajectory. So, this is a very big statement as well. Within European nations, supporting the alternative parties in Germany, France, Italy, even the UK, supporting them, building them up, cultivating this political resistance to the trajectory of the European nations. This is an enormous departure from decades of nearly absolute US deference to European elites and institutions. Europe is no longer an unquestioned pillar of the liberal order and may not even be recognizable in its current form in the decades ahead. All right, so this is what I added to this discussion. I think it's very important for policymakers to understand this. So this was a very impactful and wow moment. I think the national security strategy was shocking to a lot of people, but some things that it glossed over and it missed, I think, are extremely important. And I base this on my own macro theses and school of thought. So there was very little discussion on demographics. I mean, they did talk about it in terms of Europe, but this is a global affair. Okay, this is not a European only problem. This omission is striking because demographic decline is not a regional anomaly. It is a structural force shaping the global economy and balance of power. When it comes to the Indo Pacific, demographics are arguably an equal or greater constraint than they are in Europe, particularly given that the region's reliance on export led growth, high savings rate, and social stability. So, Europe's average fertility rate is 1.5. If you consider Japan, South Korea, China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, their average fertility is like 1. So maybe less than 1. It's a much greater constraint than it is in Europe. Japan and South Korea are clearest examples of this problem. Both are advanced, technologically sophisticated allies, yet both are facing demographic collapse at a pace that is historically unprecedented. Japan's fertility rate has been below replacement for decades. Its population is already shrinking at roughly 1% per year. South Korea's situation is even more severe, with the lowest fertility rate ever recorded in a major modern society. These trends place hard limits on long-term growth, military manpower, fiscal sustainability, and social cohesion. The demographic crisis in East Asia is so dire that it likely outweighs most of the concerns stated about this Indo-Pacific region in the national security strategy, and almost certainly will make these countries unable to be reliable ally or share any burdens. China's demographic outlook is even worse than China and Japan and South Korea. China might be slightly behind Japan as far as when the population started shrinking, but it is ahead of Japan in the rate of aging. So they started shrinking just a few years ago, where Japan has been shrinking, I think, more than a decade now. But Japan is slower. It's aging, but it's aging at a much slower pace than China. They're speeding headlong into a brick wall. China, not Japan, represents the most severe demographic shock embedded in the Indo-Pacific system. So, why even worry about 10, 20 years of trade policy when in 20 years China will have collapsed? At least the CCP will have collapsed because the demographics are just so dire. I think you should worry about what is the U.S. going to do when there is a significant uprising in China, because that is more likely than a 20 years of no uprising. Now, of course, you might not want to say that in this type of document because this is an approachable public document, but that is much more of a concern. And I'm sure they're thinking about it, but that discussion was completely absent in the document. The pearl of the first island chain, Taiwan, is also in demographic collapse, with fertility rates now tied with South Korea. They're a little bit above. South Korea is about 0.7 or 0.72, some in that ballpark, where Taiwan is 0.78. Cities like Shanghai and Hong Kong are 0.5 or below. Extremely, extremely dangerous territory. Your odds of being a grandparent are only 15 to 20%. This means that every 100 workers at peak productivity and consumption today, there will only be 39 in the next generation and 15 in the next. So you go from 100 to 15. Society will collapse. Even India, often portrayed as the great demographic counterweight to China, has now fallen below replacement fertility, meaning its demographic dividend is already peaking rather than accelerating. Taken together, demographic decline is not a European problem, it's a global one. The National Security Strategy document acknowledges demographics where the effects are already politically visible and where they want to pound on it, saying, hey, you guys can't even keep your birth rates up in Europe. Your civilization is not going to be sustainable either. But it underestimates how deeply depopulation, aging, and shrinking workforces will shape the economic power, military capacity, and geopolitical stability across Asia. Demographics may prove to be more decisive than trade policy, technological competition, or military posture in determining the long-run trajectory of the region. All right, so that was demographics. They also skipped over completely talking about credit-based monetary system. They talked about the US dollar a little bit, but nothing about the entire system itself which I think is predicated on this world that they say is over now. But let's get into it here. Another aspect that was only touched on briefly when they talk about the dollar is the monetary system itself. This omission matters a great deal. The current global monetary order is fundamentally credit-based. It relies on continual balance sheet expansion, growing cross-border capital flows, and ever-increasing leverage to function smoothly. That system did not arise in a vacuum. It was built, refined, and stabilized under the exact conditions this document now declares to be over, namely globalization. If globalization is over, we're deglobalizing now. The global monetary order as we know it is also over. A credit-based system naturally adapts to deglobalization by shrinking. That's an important statement. So if we have a credit-based system and we start deglobalizing, depopulating, what's going to happen to that credit-based system? It's also going to shrink. And that is deflation. So this is structurally deflationary, not inflationary, deflationary. You can't solve a debt problem by adding more debt. You just increase the odds of a deflationary outcome. Balance sheets contract, volume slow, capital flows needed to service the debt also slow. So it's just not a good combination. There are fewer people to take out loans, fewer entrepreneurs, and fewer businesses. There's just less economic activity, less consumption. And so everything is adding pressure towards default, and default is deflationary. The national security strategy explicitly acknowledges this tension by emphasizing production and reindustrialization and sovereignty, but it never fully grapples with the monetary consequences of dismantling the global system that previously absorbed excess savings, recycled trade surpluses, and expanded credit across borders. So it's kind of implicit in there, but they don't exactly connect the dots between deglobalization and credit-based money. It's not a good combination. At the center of this system sits U.S. Treasuries, which function as the world's primary reserve collateral. U.S. Treasuries underpin global liquidity, repo markets, derivatives, and the shadow banking system itself, not just in the United States, but the Eurodollar system, this offshore dollar system. The offshore dollar system is larger than a domestic dollar system in the United States. Foreign banks can create loans in dollars. They can print dollars outside of the United States. Okay, and so with that ability, they need U.S. Treasuries to have that money flow. So there's the global plumbing of modern finance, yet this role presupposes a world willing and able to continually accumulate dollar-denominated claims. So if the U.S. is trying to deglobalize, trying to decrease its deficits, trade deficits, that directly undermines this mechanism of U.S. Treasury circulation and liquidity. So it makes it less liquid. It doesn't say that there's going to be something to replace U.S. Treasuries, because really there could be something today to replace U.S. Treasuries, but it doesn't function as well. That's why they don't use it. There is some use of things like German bunds and Japanese JGBs and things of that nature, but it's very limited. If those were a good replacement, they would be used more already. But since they're not, it shows you that there is no real good replacement for U.S. Treasuries. And if there's less U.S. Treasuries or less trade surplus to be put into U.S. Treasuries, to add the liquidity and the lubrication to the financial system, that lubrication will get bad, it will become less liquid, and money will flow a lot less, which then in turn causes more deflationary outcomes. The national security strategy treats dollar's dominance as a strategic asset to be preserved, but does not confront whether the architecture that supports that dominance can survive in a fragmented, multipolar, and demographically shrinking world. So they're saying the system is over, but the current dollar system depends on the old system. So what happens to the dollar? That's begging the question, can a credit-based monetary system survive if you remove the underlying globalization? My view, according to evolutionary monetary theory, is that it cannot. Credit-based systems require growth. Remove those conditions and the system becomes unstable. The post-war monetary order was designed for an expanding world, and this document effectively is announcing that that world is over. If that is true, then the next question becomes what replaces the current global reserve framework? So the dollar doesn't have to go away. The dollar has changed many times, as well as the global reserve framework has changed many times. The most recent one was pretty much solidified around 1971. You could say there has been some evolution in the way these things work since then. But really, 1971 is when we went off the gold standard and when this modern system became really solidified. And so it has changed often and recently. So the next question is, what replaces this next? Historically, when trust collapses and systems contract, reserve assets shift away from credit and toward neutral, non-liability forms of money. A return to gold or the emergence of Bitcoin as a digital fixed supply alternative logically follows. Both represent assets that do not depend on someone else's promise to pay. They do not require perpetual expansion, and they do not break under balance sheet contraction. So most likely what's going to happen is in this system that they've declared that the old system is dead, the new system is deglobalization, that the current dollar system will not survive and it'll have to be replaced by something. It can be replaced by, most likely, something backing the dollar. Not treasuries, but something else. And that would be gold or Bitcoin. I think Bitcoin is the better answer. It might not be what is chosen initially. It might be, still need another couple decades or something to become more widely adopted. But that's the option. Okay, you can change the dollar. The national security strategy does not address this at all, a massive oversight. You cannot simultaneously dismantle globalization, constrain capital flows, accept demographic decline, and expect a hyper-financialized, debt-saturated monetary system to function unchanged. The strategic shift outlined in the national security strategy is clear and a breath of fresh air, but incomplete in some important ways. The realities of global fertility crises and the limitations of the credit-based system must be considered by the foreign policymakers of America first. All right, so that is that, guys. Check out roguemacro.substack.com. Sign up to become a paid member, get access to all my posts there, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Bye.